20th July 1944. Only hours after German officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at the Wolfschanze, his East Prussian headquarters in Rustenburg, the Führer kept his scheduled appointments, including a meeting with Italy's fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. Behind the assassination were several groups of German resistance who hoped that Hitler's violent death would spark an uprising against the Nazis and the overthrow of the National Socialist German government. The Führer, however, survived the explosion and the coup attempt failed. In the days that followed, Adolf Hitler ordered a massive manhunt for the conspirators that spanned several months. In the end, more than 7,000 people were arrested. Many of those involved came before the notorious People's Court, which, in show trials, sentenced thousands of Germans to death, often on the flimsiest of evidence. Its president was a fanatical Nazi, Judge Roland Freisler. Roland Freisler was born on 30 October 1893 in Celle, the son of an engineer and teacher. When World War I began on 28 July 1914, Freisler was studying law at the University of Jena. He broke off his studies and volunteered as an officer candidate for the Wehrmacht. In 1915, he was a lieutenant and was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for his bravery in action. In October of the same year, Freisler was taken prisoner of war by the Russians on the Eastern Front and interned in an officers' camp near Moscow. Although the prisoners were released in 1918 and sent home, Freisler remained in Soviet Russia until 1919. He learned to speak fluent Russian and is believed to have been a convinced supporter of Bolshevism at this time. In 1919, Freisler returned to Germany to complete his law studies at the University of Jena. In 1922, he received his doctorate in law. In July 1929, Freisler joined the NSDP. He immediately gained authority within the party as he used his legal training to defend its members who were regularly charged with acts of political violence. From 1924 to 1935, he worked as a lawyer, often insulting and threatening colleagues, victims, or judges in almost all trials. Yet he was never disbarred. Karl Winrich, Gauleiter of the NSDP Gau Hessen, characterized Freisler as follows in a 1927 report to the party leadership in Munich. Rhetorically, he is a match for our best speakers, if not superior. He has a particular influence on the large masses, but thinking people usually reject him internally. The report concluded, "Party member Freisler can only be used as a speaker. He is unsuitable for any leadership position because he is unreliable and too dependent on moods." After Adolf Hitler and the NSDP came to power in January 1933, Freisler became a member of the Reichstag, the German parliament. He was also appointed ministerial director in the Prussian Ministry of Justice and state secretary in the Prussian and Reich Ministries of Justice. With the founding of the Academy for German Law, Freisler became a member and chairman of the Criminal Law Committee. The Academy was tasked with promoting the reorganization of German legal life and realizing the Nazi socialist program in the entire field of law. Freisler's excellent knowledge of legal texts, his mental agility, his dramatic linguistic skill, and his verbal power, combined with his ardent enthusiasm for Nazi socialist ideology, made him the most feared judge in the Nazi socialist German Reich and the embodiment of Nazi socialism in German law. Even though he used almost any means to serve his racist worldview, he was not appointed by Adolf Hitler to any office outside the judiciary. This was not only because he was a loner who lacked support in the higher ranks of the Nazi hierarchy, but also because he was compromised by his brother, Oswald Freisler, also a lawyer. Oswald had repeatedly defended against the authority of the regime in politically significant trials. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels reprimanded Oswald Freisler and reported his behavior to Adolf Hitler, who then ordered Oswald Freisler's expulsion from the party. In 1939,
Oswald Freisler committed suicide in Berlin.
Roland Freisler, however,
Was a convinced Nazi and used his legal knowledge to implement Nazi ideology. He published a paper titled The Racial Biological Task in the Reform of Juvenile Criminal Law, in which he advocated placing racially foreign, racially degenerate, or severely disturbed young people in correctional facilities and separating them from racially valuable individuals. He also strongly advocated for the creation of laws to punish so-called Rassenschande, the Nazi term for sexual relations between Aryans and people considered to be of inferior races. Freisler's ideological views were groundbreaking for the future, as 2 years later, in 1935, the Nazi regime announced the Nuremberg Laws, which prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and people of German or related blood. World War II began on September 1, 1939. In the following month, Freisler introduced the concept of the juvenile serious offender in the Juvenile Criminal Law Ordinance. This decree, for the first time in German legal history, laid the foundation for the imposition of the death penalty and penal servitude against juveniles. At least 72 German juveniles were sentenced to death by the Nazi central courts. When Goebbels suggested 2 years later, in 1941, to appoint Freisler as the successor of the deceased Reich Minister of Justice, Hitler replied, referring to Freisler's alleged red past, "This old Bolshevik? No." On January 20, 1942, Freisler attended the Wannsee Conference, where 15 high-ranking NSDAP officials and representatives of the German government met to discuss and coordinate the implementation of the so-called final solution, the euphemistic term for the systematic extermination of European Jewry. None of the officials present, including Freisler, who was to advise the plan legally, raised objections to the policy of the final solution announced by Reinhard Heydrich. On August 20, 1942, Freisler was appointed president of the People's Court by Hitler. He presided over the first Senate of the court in a red-blooded judge's robe, in a courtroom decorated with scarlet swastika banners and a large black bust of Adolf Hitler behind his chair. He opened every session from the judge's bench with the Nazi salute. He simultaneously acted as prosecutor, juror, and judge. Under Freisler's presidency, the number of death sentences dramatically increased. About 90% of all proceedings ended with guilty verdicts. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 5,000 death sentences were handed down, 2,600 of them by Freisler's first Senate of the court. In his 3 years as president, he was responsible for as many death sentences as all the other 5 Senates combined. His methods involved the deliberate and targeted humiliation of the defendants, both verbally and non-verbally. For example, the Nazis gave the defendants worn, oversized, and beltless clothing. Because they had to stand during their testimony in court, they were forced to constantly hold up their trousers. When Hans and Sophie Scholl, members of the White Rose Resistance Group, were arrested in February 1943 for distributing leaflets, Freisler was flown to Munich to preside over the trial. Sophie was offered a reduced sentence if she would testify that her brother had misled her, but she refused, stating, "I will betray neither my brother nor my principles. I will make no deals with the Nazis." When she appeared in court, she said to Freisler, "You know as well as I do that the war is lost. Why don't you admit it?" After half a day of deliberation, the Scholl siblings and Christoph Probst were sentenced to death by hanging, but were killed by guillotine. At the second trial against the White Rose members, Freisler screamed at the defendants that National Socialism did not need any penal code against such traitors, and he hurled the criminal codebook toward the defendants' bench. Another victim of Freisler was Alfreda Schultz, the sister of the German writer Erich Maria Remarque. Alfreda was arrested after her landlord betrayed her to the Gestapo for saying that the war led by the Nazis was lost. The charge against her was undermining military strength. During the trial, Freisler said to Alfreda, "Your brother unfortunately escaped us, but you will not escape us." Alfreda Schultz was beheaded by guillotine on December 16, 1943. In August 1944, some of the arrested instigators of the failed July 20th assassination attempt were brought before Freisler. Hitler had ordered that the guilty be hung like cattle. The proceedings were filmed to show how Freisler conducted his court. He often switched between factual questioning and a sudden verbal tirade that included insulting the defendants from the judge's bench. Thus, Freisler yelled at Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was trying to hold up his deliberately given, worn, oversized, and beltless trousers. "You dirty old man, why do you keep fumbling with your trousers?" However, the defendants never lost their dignity. The final words Witzleben addressed to Freisler have said to have been, "You can hand us to the hangman. In 3 months, the outraged and tormented people will bring you to account and drag you alive through the dirt of the streets." Caesar von Hofacker, the leading personality of the resistance in France, interrupted Freisler saying, "You shut up now, Mr. Freisler, because today it's about my head. In a year it will be about yours." When Ulrich von Schwanenfeld, marked by the conditions of his imprisonment, tried to maintain his dignity, declaring his opposition to Hitler was due to the many murders, an enraged Freisler yelled him down and told him, "You are now just a pile of misery." In the end, more than 7,000 people were arrested. 4,980 of them were sentenced to death by Freisler. Justice finally caught up with Freisler in February 1945. On the morning of February 3, 1945, Freisler was presiding over a Saturday session of the People's Court when Berlin was attacked by bombs from the U.S. Army. When Freisler heard the air raid siren, he hastily adjourned the court and ordered the prisoners to be taken to an air raid shelter while he himself remained behind to pack files. At 11:08, a bomb struck the courthouse, which partially collapsed, and a beam loosened, killing Freisler instantly. The crushed remains of Freisler were found under the rubble where he still clutched the files he had just collected. According to another account, he was killed by a bomb splinter as he tried to escape, bleeding to death on the pavement in front of the People's Court. Louise von Benda, the wife of General Alfred Jodl, recounted more than 25 years later that when Freisler's body was delivered to the hospital, a hospital worker commented, "This is a God judgment." No one retorted anything. Freisler's body was buried in his wife's family grave in Berlin. Freisler's name is not on the gravestone. No tears were shed for Roland Freisler.